Podcast mic is out. I have my notes. I have my tea. We are ready. We're doing this. Can you tell I've had a little bit of a rough start this morning? Because I sure can. Hi, my name is Lindy Jung. I am a soon-to-be traditionally published science fiction and fantasy author. My debut novel, MOTHSBLOOD, comes out from Bloomsbury in the US and Del Rey in the UK in fall 26? Yeah, fall 2026. So my last craft video actually did, like, numbers, which it's an interesting reversal. I've been doing this for a long time. Not to get too deep into the weeds and nuances of AuthorTube content creation, but I feel like for a while it was writing vlogs that would do a lot better, and now for some reason it seems like you guys want craft videos, so let's do a craft video. I've had a bunch of these sitting in my notes app for so long. Like, this, I think, was originally conceived in like 2022 or 2023, but I beefed up the outline and we are going to talk about conflict. So what is conflict? Loosely speaking, I would define conflict as any sort of struggle or opposition between two forces, ideas, people, etc. But the reason we're talking about conflict today is because conflict is also key to story. Conflict is what creates those major plot points. It pushes characters to change either by growing or becoming worse. Conflict also comes in many shapes and sizes. So for example, the conflict in a literary fiction novel is going to look significantly different from the conflict in an epic fantasy. Because conflict is such a broad topic and it has a lot of nuance to it, it can be really difficult to discuss in a way that will cover everything for every writer, which of course, no writing advice really does that, so we're gonna get rid of that notion right here. But I'm going to talk about conflict to the best of my ability as someone who kind of writes these, or tries to write these literary-leaning genre fiction books, specifically in the spec fic, sci-fi, fantasy space. And as someone in that kind of unique niche who also reads a lot of books in that sort of unique niche, personally I feel like that standard, straightforward, good versus evil, archetypical fantasy conflict that we see and associate heavily with these kinds of books, that doesn't always work for me. And so I've come up with this way to talk about and think about layered conflict. Conflict that goes beyond the surface level, that really incorporates and integrates these more literary conventions of having a more internal conflict or an ideological conflict at the center of the story. I'm going to talk about the tree of conflict, which is just something I came up with to help visualize this sort of layered conflict where there are three components. We'll get into those in a little bit, but I do want to give my usual disclaimer, which is that prescriptivist writing advice is for the birds. I am very specifically talking about my unique angle in this very, very broad topic. What I share here has been helpful to me, but it is certainly not absolute. It may not service you and your story and your story's needs, and that is totally okay. But if you are able to glean something helpful from this video, then let me know. That makes me really happy to hear. Also, before we kick off the discussion, I did want to just very quickly let you guys know that I am hosting another mechanical keyboard giveaway. This is alongside the company Mechlands. They were generous enough to help me host my last keyboard giveaway, and we are giving away the M75 magnetic mechanical keyboard. I love this thing. It is so sturdy and it kind of just matches my like swampy green and black desk aesthetic right now. So if you're interested in getting an M75 of your very own completely for free, there is a Google form linked in the description box and the comments below. Literally all you have to do is enter your name, your email, and whether you're 18 and over or based in the US and Canada. The giveaway will kick off once this video is released on June 15th and it'll go until July 15th. So you have 1 month to enter, only one entry per person please, and I think that should cover it. Let's get into the video. Part 1. The importance of layered conflict. I'm gonna kick this off with a little bit of a story time. Back when I was a very young, very fresh writer, querying my young adult contemporary fantasy, which was like the first book I wrote. I'd spent 10 years on it at that point because I'd been writing it, living in that world, developing those characters since I was a kid. It was like a really big source of comfort for me. I was lucky enough to get a whole bunch of full requests through a pitch competition from literary agents, so I sent over my full manuscript. I got a whole bunch of rejections, and one rejection in particular still stands out to me. It said something along the lines of, the characters are engaging and the world is fun, but the plot feels frictionless. Really rough to hear, but 5-ish, more than that honestly, 7 years down the line, that's a piece of feedback that really has stuck with me and that I hear in the back of my head every time I approach the development of a new story. Because that agent was absolutely right. That draft of the book that they read had plot events happening. Like, conflict was occurring in terms of physical action and fight scenes, but the actual internal conflict, the decisions that the main character was being faced with, they didn't hold enough weight. As I said before, at the end of the day, conflict is story. To me, interesting conflict is layered conflict. Conflict that not only occurs on multiple levels, so external, internal, ideological, but also has consequences on all three of those levels. Without external conflict, the world will not change. You need those sword fights to determine who comes out on top, whose status quo changes. But without internal conflict, the characters aren't going to change. They aren't going to be faced with those tough decisions that really define who they are and define and punctuate the trajectory of their character arc. And without ideological conflict, your theme loses weight. It loses that little je ne sais quoi that makes the reader really consider what you're trying to say beneath the surface. A proper combination of these three types of conflict gives a story really exciting forward or backwards, any kind of momentum, really. It gives the characters opportunities to learn and to grow, which in turn helps develop the theme, and that ideological conflict is really what's going to make your reader think about what's going on the page. But all of that is a lot easier said than done, and how do we actually blend these types of conflict and these ideas together in a cohesive way that makes for a story that's coherent as well as propulsive and interesting? Let's talk about, I think, relatively easy way to break it down using the tree of conflict. Part 2, the tree of conflict. I had to take a break because my allergies are driving me crazy. Okay, let's talk about the tree of conflict. The tree of conflict consists of three main parts. So we have the external conflict, which is the physical obstacles and challenges that the characters are facing throughout the story. The internal conflict is all about what the characters are facing internally. So are they being forced to confront their past? Are they being forced to confront some sort of fundamental key character flaw? Do they have to decide between two very difficult and equally compelling choices? The sky's the limit, honestly. But at the end of the day, internal conflict is going to push a character to change fundamentally in some way. And then we have the ideological or thematic conflict. This one's a little more subtle. It is the conflict between two opposing ideas or values, and it likely will tie very heavily into either the external or the internal conflict, or both. But this one is more subtextual, and it's not really going to manifest as a battle or an argument. It's really going to be shown or expressed through the decisions the characters are making, through the outcomes of various challenges and obstacles, so on and so forth. So basically, theme. These three layers of conflict make up the overall structure of the tree, but they are all also connected. I also want to point out that depending on the themes you're trying to explore, or the trajectory of your character arcs, or your story, or your genre, or your personal preferences as a writer, literally any number of reasons, one or more of these branches may be more prominent in your story than others. For example, harkening back to sort of this like action-adventure kind of fantasy concept, external conflict is probably going to be the most prominent, the most upfront type of conflict, brings about the most change in the story. But that does not mean that you can completely forsake internal and ideological conflict. Again, that's kind of where we get this frictionless idea, right? Yeah, you can have two people fighting with swords all day long, but if they have nothing at stake, if they're both just two cardboard cutouts with fencing swords and there's no ideological conflict at play or internal conflict happening with each of the characters, like what are the stakes for them? What happens if they lose? That's when we get this idea that it's just a fight scene and it's not particularly interesting or important. To visualize these three major types of conflict, I actually wanted to talk about AMC's Breaking Bad. I guess spoilers for Breaking Bad if you haven't seen it, but I do think it's such a cultural touchstone that at this point that like you probably know that Walter White deals drugs. What am I saying? So spoilers for Breaking Bad, but also I'm just gonna kind of be talking in broad terms about stuff that I feel like most people know whether or not they've seen the show because it is such a cultural touch point. So, you know, do with that what you will. External conflict of Breaking Bad. Very straightforward. Walter White actually has countless sources of external conflict because his side job is cooking drugs. Which, you know, he made that choice. That's on him. He faces off against the DEA. He faces off against, like, rival gangs, drug dealers, drug people. It's been a minute since I've seen this show, can you tell? And also his own partner. His life and the lives of people around him are constantly in danger because of his position as a drug dealer. But the internal conflict is really where the show shines, in my opinion, because Walter is, from the beginning, on one hand, he's like a very family-oriented former high school teacher who is struggling with cancer. He has strong family ties to his wife's family, one of whom is literally part of the DEA. Like, his brother-in-law is, you know, in opposition to him, but his brother-in-law doesn't know it. And also his other persona, where he's like a prideful and increasingly violent criminal. Over the course of the show, it becomes more and more difficult for him to keep these lives separate, if he was ever really managing to keep them apart at all. And the hardened worldview that he gains from his criminality begins to affect his day-to-day life, his other half, particularly his relationships with his family. But it does also go a little deeper than that. There's an angle to the conflict where it's not just a conflict between his two personas, but a conflict between Walter's reality, which is that he is choosing a life of crime to provide for his family, and also this delusion that he maintains that he can still be like a regular person. He thinks he can do it all, and he can't. And then we have the ideological conflict of Breaking Bad, which honestly I would sum up for the show as a whole. It's about greed. It's about power. Why did that sound like a bar? As we progress through the story, it kind of shifts, really. The initial ideological conflict that Walter deals with is, you know, living life as an upstanding citizen, kind of taking all of the many, many punches delivered to him, and eventually just going completely destitute because his cancer treatment is expensive, or breaking the law, doing criminal things, providing for yourself, providing for your family. As he falls deeper and deeper into that sinkhole of criminality, it really does become a story of like, when do you stop? Where do you draw the line? When is it enough? And that ideological conflict really informs the development of his character throughout the story. I hope that helps illustrate it for y'all. Sorry that I used Breaking Bad as a reference. I love Breaking Bad. Let's go into part 3. Part 3, stakes. Stakes are basically what the characters of a given story have to gain or lose as a result of engaging in the conflict. So, the conflict happens, they get through it, maybe they succeed, maybe they fail. What do they gain? What do they lose? Stakes can be physical, but they certainly don't have to be, and honestly, I think one of the bigger, I don't want to say mistakes, but I do think that there's a tendency, particularly in like genre fiction, for newer writers to think that all stakes have to be life or death. But when all stakes are life or death, none of them are life or death, in that having that heightened stake for every conflict cheapens the conflict. Stakes also do not have to be singular. In fact, sometimes I think the more that a character has to lose, the better, and more complex and nuanced the conflict can be. So for example, a common framework used to discuss character motivation is their want versus their need. What do they think they want versus what do they actually need? And a lot of the times people will kind of frame a character journey by having a character start out by thinking that what they want is the end all be all, and then having them discover what they actually needed all along. I think this is very common in romance. So for example, a more complicated stake might have a character go through a conflict and then gain what they want, what they've been trying to get this whole time, but actually lose what they really needed and realize just a little too late that that was what they needed. I feel like I said need a lot right there, and that's okay. So Breaking Bad is going to be my go-to example for the rest of this video, I guess. Just this one. Right from the start, Walter has a lot to lose and a lot to gain, although he does think he has nothing to lose because he is actively dying from cancer. One thing that he has to lose or gain, money. He makes real, solid, aggressive amounts of money from cooking his product because he's quite good at it. Another stake is his life. He's putting his life and his physical well-being just in terms of his health, and also like the threat of murder, or that is put at risk pretty regularly because of the types of people he engages with, and also because of the risky nature of the cooking process. And then there's this constant threat that, you know, he's going to get caught and go to prison, which would not only very much ruin his life, but ruin his family's life, particularly because his brother-in-law is in the DEA that is now starting to actively seek him out. Also, he has the love and regard of his family. That's a major stake. Again, if he gets caught or if they just find out what he's up to, he could absolutely lose the regard of his wife and his son, but at the same time, he justifies his actions by saying he's providing for them. He's trying to set them up for after he's gone. But as he falls deeper and deeper into that rabbit hole of his criminal lifestyle, I guess you could say, the stakes become actually a bit more ideological. The actions he takes and the choices he makes start to define him, and then we get into that ideological stake of his next choice really solidifying him as this bad person who does terrible things. So at some point in the show, the stakes become Walter losing himself entirely. Part 4, scene level conflict. Now that we've talked about the 3 layers of conflict and we've defined stakes and their role in conflict a little bit more clearly, how do we actually write conflict into a story? Everything is easier said than done. I can sit here and talk about, the tree of conflict and Breaking Bad all day, but we are writers, we're not really show analysis people. How do we write this into a story? Let's say you've got your story set up, world, characters, you understand their backstory, and you've drawn out a tree of conflict. So you understand the overarching types of conflict that are going to be happening in your story. But stories are made up of multiple scenes, not just 3 big scenes where different types of conflict happen. And scenes are driven by smaller conflicts connected to those 3 main branches of conflict. So as you're coming up with scene ideas, I want you to keep referring back to this tree of conflict for sources of conflict. Every scene should have some type of headbutting, some type of conflict, however small. Obviously, there's going to be moments like the climax where that conflict gets really big and you can build up to that point, but in order to diversify those smaller types of conflict that drive the shorter scenes throughout the story as you're leading up to those big explosive moments, you can try diversifying the types of conflict you're exploring. You can highlight a different branch with different scenes, and this might lend itself naturally. You might be doing this subconsciously without even knowing it. For example, that external conflict is going to come into play in a fight scene, a character reflecting and having to come to terms with a major decision on their own in a moment of quiet. That's going to be the internal conflict. But how do we string all of these together? Every scene should sort of connect into the next, more or less. There's obviously exceptions to this, especially if you have multiple points of view. I do have a separate video about the 3 C's of character-driven storytelling, which are context, conflict, and consequence. So feel free to check out that video if you think it'll be helpful for you. I found it very helpful and I made it. So I don't know what that says about the video or about myself. However, I did want to give you guys an example, kind of show you what I mean. So let's develop a series of scene level conflicts together. Setting up the scenario, I'm gonna read off. A warrior is sent on a quest by her ailing king to find a cure for his mysterious illness. For context, she's the last of a very old guard of loyal warriors who have sworn fealty to the royal bloodline, and all of the women in her family have served in this guard that she's in. She very much looked up to and respected her mother, who was also on the guard for the former king, which is the current king's dad, if that wasn't clear. And she was incredibly good at her job, well respected, maybe won a war or something. This character wants to be exactly like her mom, but this king is not really like his father at all. He's actually kind of a loser. And although this isn't malevolent, he has been screwing up the kingdom, just like by being kind of inept. The warrior, the main character, she's very practical. She sees what's going on. She's not delusional about it, but she's also kind of like, well, it's not really my job to tell him how to manage the country. My duty is more important, really, and at the end of the day, my job is to protect this guy, not to worry so much about how his actions are affecting the kingdom, because that's what, like, his retinue is for, right? His, like, noble advisors, whatever. To complicate it further, she also grew up with the king. They obviously, like, occupied the same circles, are roughly the same age. Maybe actually he's a bit younger than her, so it's almost like she feels like his older sister in a way. And so she has a personal connection to him. She cares about him as a person. She sees that he's not a malevolent, ruler. He's not doing this on purpose. He's just not really good at his job. So she's going on this quest. She's saving his life. She is kind of fed up. She's at the end of her rope. She wants to basically do this one thing, save his life, do her job really well, and then retire. So complicated relationship with a very inept ruler, complicated sort of ideological relationship. You can kind of see the setup here, I think. So now let's come up with a couple of scenes. Obviously the scenario here is that she's going on a journey. It's a pretty straightforward quest narrative. There's lots of opportunities to sprinkle in some unique little bits of external conflict. Maybe monsters, maybe a witch with crazy spells. I'm gonna go with bandits. She's traveling kind of incognito. She isn't wearing like her armor. Her sword is at her side. She's trying not to draw attention to herself. Nonetheless, she's a traveler on the road alone, and a lone bandit sees this as an opportunity. There's a little scuffle. She easily disarms the bandit, and it is the law for robbers to like get their hands cut off or something, physical and bad happens to them. And she's about to do that physical bad thing. And then she sees that the bandit is a kid. So here we have an external conflict beat, and the consequences of that external conflict, her having caught the bandit and now having to make a decision, is she going to cut off his finger or no? That is going to lead kind of into that next beat of conflict. So now she has to make a choice. Is she going to cut off the finger of a kid who's like crying and wailing and like is really scared and obviously hungry? And so she chooses not to. She instead asks the kid bandit what they were doing. Like, what are you thinking? And she gets the answer that the kid's family hasn't eaten in a really long time because of the king's new taxation policy on their town. They were farmers, they were doing pretty well, at least being able to provide for themselves, but now they have to give like the majority of what they grow and process to the kingdom. And the warrior's like, oh my god. I knew that law went into place, but this is my first time really seeing the effects that it has on people. And she also knows that the taxes were put into place because the king is inept. He's like gone into debt or something and like needs to really heavily tax his population because he needs that money really fast. This is her first real moment of understanding that the king's ineptitude that she has put up with because she cares about him. He's like her little brother and she has a duty to him and she wants to be like her mom. The stuff she's been excusing because of those things, the stuff she's been justifying, have real actual consequences. But it's still a little early in the story. She's not going to make her big decision yet. She lets the kid go. She carries on with her quest. Consequence of choosing to let the kid go. Kid runs off, finds some other bandits. They jump her at night as a big group and they're ready this time. Like they are ready to fight. She actually probably could take them, but she hesitates because she sees the kid again who she now has had a conversation with. And because of that moment of hesitation, she is actually captured. And she's like, I am a good warrior, right? I know I can fight my way out of this situation, but like people are going to get hurt, most likely die, and I just feel bad. Like I feel guilty knowing that in some way she feels responsible for the king's actions and knowing that this is like a whole town of people who have turned to crime, kind of like Walter White because of her king's ineptitude and because of his unjust policies. But then they find out that she is associated with the king and they're pretty angry. Like maybe, I don't know, she has a medallion or a token or something, and just like by association she kind of becomes the enemy and they decide to kill her. Again, we're seeing this like life or death stakes. She does fight her way out of it. The original kid bandit does die in the process of her fighting her way out of it, and she's injured. Now she has to continue this quest feeling really messed up about this thing she had to do. And so this is where, instead of making a decision, she retreats. She kind of, not regresses, but goes into a worse place. She veers completely off course with the quest. She goes a couple villages down into a tavern, drowns her sorrows, and is just not dealing with the issue. But it's just accumulating, it's becoming worse and worse. This internal conflict is festering rather than being dealt with, and she's having all these like internal conversations about like duty versus sacrifice versus justification of violence. And you know, she's killed people for this king, this person who is now in turn not even being a good king, is actually being a bad king to his own people. Is her duty to this individual who she has a relationship with and cares about and grew up with, or is her duty to the realm and to the people? And maybe as she's going through this, she has a chance encounter or an encounter she drives that kind of pushes her in a new direction. I hope that kind of makes sense, like how each conflict leads into the next, that blend of external, internal, ideological, but also it kind of illustrates, I hope, how important context is. Like the context section of my notes here was the longest part because you really need context to build conflict off of. There we have it. Pretty quick. Nope, not at all. That actually took a really long time. It took like an hour. I hope this was helpful for you. I do really enjoy making writing craft videos, talking about craft in general. So if you have any suggestions or things that you want to see me talk about or discuss in this way, please let me know in the comments below. Remember to sign up for the Mechlands mechanical keyboard giveaway if you're interested in winning a mechanical keyboard. And I guess if you don't have a suggestion for a future video, then you can let me know how you approach conflict in your stories or what the main type of conflict is in your current story. Thank you so much for watching this video. You can find me on here with semi-weekly videos. My upload schedule's a little bit of a mess right now. Bye.